interrogation of Jesus and also the pressures that were brought to bear on him when he tried to get Jesus released from what he was undergoing. And let's, where we left off on verses 12 through 16, and I had some more information to share on this section. So let's read those verses. Can you read those, Dale, please?
From now on, I will not release him. But the Jews cried out, saying, if you let this man go, you are not Caesar's friend. Whoever makes himself a king speaks against Caesar. When Pilate therefore heard that saying, he brought Jesus out and sat down in the judgment seat in a place that is called the Pavement, but in Hebrew, Gabbatha. Now it was the preparation day of the Passover, and about the 6th hour. And he said to the Jews, behold your king.
All right, now I forgot what I was going to put on the slide, so I will just go by what I wanted to share. Last week where we ended is this threat of the Jews. You let this man go, you are not Caesar's friend. And we talked about some of the history that's secular in nature in terms of how this pressure was brought to bear, because there were things that Pilate did before this point that the Jews had appealed to Caesar, and they basically won the appeal, not in that terms of getting Pilate out of his position, but Pilate was certainly weakened by those. And that's not mentioned, those things aren't mentioned in the Bible, but Pilate here, that threat really got to him. And just a basic point of this is that he ends up going to this place called the Pavement or Gabbatha. Because of this threat of going to Caesar, he realized, I've got to get things under control. I now need to decide this case. And it doesn't mean that he's not going to give up on trying to get them to be willing to release Jesus, but he realizes, I have to do something. And that's kind of the basic premise of this section here. Now we're going to look at what Gabbatha is. We're also going to take a look at the timing of this too, because as we're going to see, that's an important issue in this section. So normally what we have seen in these events is that Pilate has been in the Praetorium. You probably have heard that word repeated, and that part of the building or structure is actually where Pilate lived. It was called the palace. It would have been his palace, and the officer quarters as well. So it was a structure that would have been not just really like a home environment, but also some of his executive business had to be done there as well. And then this Gabbatha place is a little bit different, because now it would have been the place where he had to be like a judge. Think of it being like a courtroom, if you will. We're going to look into this just a bit. It actually literally means a pavement of stones, and visibly it would have basically been a place where stones on the floor, so tiled floor type of thing. So this would be the place where he would have his final stroke of judgment. He could not be wishy-washy after this, like he had been with all the other things he had tried to do to get Jesus released. And one of the things that was unique about Roman justice is that it was very transparent. It was done publicly on purpose because they wanted people to feel the threat of the Romans. They wanted to make people aware they were the ones in charge. And so whatever they rendered, it was like, that was it. You know what it kind of reminds me of is think of how many, if you're watching like an athletic event, and how many people complain about the umpiring and refereeing. Do they ever change when you complain? No, it just doesn't happen. It's like, why do it? But same thing with Roman justice. They aren't so transparent, it's so public what they were doing. So the Gabbatha would have probably appeared something like this. It would have probably been very likely outdoors. There have been some that suggested it was indoors, but you can see the stones on the where Jesus is standing. Now this is where they actually say when you go to the Holy Land, this is where they say it is. Here it shows it as being an indoor structure. Of course, this is not. What's happened since Jesus was there, when he lived there, is that there's been so many buildings that have been erected and then torn down and then erected again. We have no idea if this is the actual location, but they say it is. And if it is, then they probably built something over it, and that's the point here. So, anyway, the key thing is that Pilate had to make this decision. So, anything on Gabbatha? I want to look at the timeline here. Chapter 19, verse 14 is kind of a passage we're going to look at here for a little bit. Now it was preparation day. It was the preparation day of the Passover in about the 6th hour. And he said to the Jews, "Behold your king." Preparation day of the Passover. That would have simply been the fact, remember this was a Friday. The Sabbath day of the Jews was on a Saturday, and so they would have had to rest on a Saturday, and so all their preparations were done the day before. So they had to get those done this particular day, at least the Jews would have had to. Now the confusion that really comes in here is in verse 14 when it says it was about the 6th hour. About the 6th hour. Trust me, if you were to go online and look at this, you will see a million different ways of looking at that verse. That part of the verse. It's a very puzzling thing. It's obviously some sort of reference to time. I probably should have been careful about this particular bullet because I don't know if I should have. I would word it like this, given my study. I don't know if it's actually the time of day that he's speaking about here, and I'll explain that in a moment. Normally, when you think of the 6th hour, John was a Jew, but being that he was writing the book of John at a much later time when there would now be Gentiles in the church, he probably, I don't know if he would use Jewish time or Roman time. It's hard to say. Who knows what would have been going through his mind. We do know that Matthew and Mark in particular would have had time references to Jewish time because when they wrote their Gospels, it was primarily to the Jews. Matthew hones in on trying to reach out to the Jews with his gospel. And he uses Jewish time. Matthew and Mark, when they are talking about these events, seem to sync together quite well. For instance, in Mark 15:25, it says that Jesus was crucified at the 3rd hour, or what we would know to be 9 a.m. Let's look at that one, Mark 15:25. Last week, when I was going to get to this section, I was just merely going to say there's a lot of puzzling things about this, and I dug in it to some more, and I don't know, we'll see how this discussion goes. But Mark 15:25. Jeremiah, do you have that?
Yeah. Now it was the 3rd hour, and they crucified him.
Third hour. That simple. So, Jewish time, 6 o'clock would be like the 0 hour, 9 o'clock the third hour, noon would be the 12th hour, 3 o'clock would be the 15th hour, that kind of thing. Did I do that right? 15? All right.
That was military.
Did I do it wrong?
No, you didn't.
What?
Okay. Guess I heard you wrong.
3 o'clock would be 9th hour. 9th hour. I'm sorry. Yeah. 9th hour. Yeah, military would be, yeah, you would do it. Okay, so some, to try to rectify, if you have Mark saying that Jesus is crucified at 9 a.m., and you have, you guys are, hopefully you're seeing the conundrum here, because here he is before Pontius Pilate, and it says it's the 6th hour. Okay, so it seems like they're in conflict if Jesus is crucified at the 3rd hour. We're talking about an event that obviously would have had to happen before he was crucified here. So one of the things, this is why it becomes a key thing, is because there are those that don't care about the inerrancy of the Bible and want to make it, there's contradictions and things like that, will try to say here that you've got a problem. And so the liberal Christians, what they will do is that they will say, well, there was a misprint here. That even though it says the 6th hour here in John, it really was a misprint. It should have said about the 3rd hour. And, because it would have happened just before he was crucified. Now, I believe that's a cop-out. That really, and it takes away the inerrancy of the Bible, because we know that what we have is the accurate Word of God. So some other Christians, these are the ones who are trying to justify it from the standpoint of trying to try to show that it's still inerrant. What they will suggest is that John is using Roman time, and so when he says it's the 6th hour, they believe it would have been around 6 a.m. Now, the problem with that, in a sense, is that early in the morning, we know that Jesus is brought to Pilate, and there was time that transpired between the events that we've been talking about, like with him, the crown of thorns, the scourging, the purple robe, going back and forth between Pilate having Jesus go to Herod. There would have obviously been some time that transpired there, and it makes sense that it would probably have been a couple of hours at least. So when the Jews brought him to the Romans, it probably would have been maybe 5 or 6 a.m. It would have been the break of day. And the other thing that's the problem is if you take the 6th hour here as Roman time, it being 6 a.m., then you have all the other references of time in John's Gospel that seem, and I'm using the word seem here, to be references to Jewish time. So you almost have to study each of the references of time in John's Gospel to where is he saying here? And I know that a lot of times it probably doesn't matter a whole lot to us today, but there's still, we believe that God's Word is inspired and that it's true, okay? So let me dig into this a little bit more. When it says about the 6th hour, another possibility here is that it could be talking about the amount of time that had transpired from the time Jesus got arrested to now Jesus being before Pontius Pilate and about ready to go to the cross. If that is true, if Jesus was arrested around 1 or 2 a.m., then we're talking about 7 to 8 a.m. on Good Friday. That makes a little sense to me. about the 6th hour. It's not talking about the time of day, but rather the time that has transpired. And that's probably something some people probably don't give a lot of thought to. Just let me finish here, okay? It fits a little bit from the standpoint that Jesus would have been with his disciples the night before. They had their supper, and then they went off to the Garden of Gethsemane where Jesus prayed. It was there that he would have been arrested. Now, maybe it was 11. We don't really know what time he was arrested, so that's the other problem. Can I bring up the other possibility before or do you have a question about this particular point? Is it about this particular point?
Yes.
Or are you going to add in some other possibility?
Well, you're gonna,
Can I continue
well, you
on?
can tell me. Matthew says at the 9th hour, he cried out,
We're gonna get into that.
All right, my point is, Matthew is written for the Jews, John for the Gentiles. John interprets.
We don't know about John being for the Gentiles. That was my point, is that Luke is the Gentiles. John, we don't really know what his references to time are. You have to look at it. And so, can I finish my thought before you continue on? Because I think you'll see the picture, okay? So there's another possibility here. And that is, it could be when Jesus was starting to be on trial. So that would have been during the night when he was before, Annas, before the high priest, and then before Pilate in the morning. So now I read something on this, and it made a lot of sense to me, because now you're talking about the connection between what he also says in this verse in John 14, or 19:14. It says that he makes a reference. It was the preparation day of the Passover, in about the 6th hour. And the preparation of the Passover would have been a reference to something Jewish. Okay? And the Passover itself was a celebration to point to the Passover lamb who would come. And I think that John connects those two together purposely, because now you have Jesus on trial, and Pilate himself said this earlier in John 18:38, I find no fault in him at all, meaning he's innocent. And the whole reference to the Passover lamb is that the Passover lamb had to be spotless. It couldn't have any defect on its skin or anything like that. And now you see Jesus fulfilling that Passover prophecy where he himself is spotless, he's innocent, he's sinless, he's righteous. And so John's connection there to the Passover makes a lot of sense to me. There's only one guy I saw talk about that. I was amazed by that. Let's look at 1 Corinthians 5:7 on that. 1 Corinthians 5:7. Heidi, did you read?
Therefore, purge out the old leaven, that you may be a new lump, since you truly are unleavened. For indeed, Christ our Passover was sacrificed for us.
So here again, the reference to Christ being our Passover. You have here purging out the old leaven too. The fact that that's talking about us as people. Our repentant attitude reflects how Jesus himself. He himself was the sinless Lamb of God who was charged with our sins and sacrificed for us. So, be innocent as Christ was innocent is the idea here. But also that he's the Passover. Now, before I know you guys are anxious here, but I want to put up this because I think I saw this illustration. I thought it helps see clearly for us today, has our clock, so you can kind of see some of the timeline. But the guess is, and I know that this is 6 a.m., but it's also 6 p.m. I think of a clock. So very likely they would have brought Jesus early in the morning, maybe around 6. And what we're talking about is probably around 8 o'clock. Mark says that he was crucified at 9. And then in that Matthew passage that I was going to get to, Matthew 27:45, it talks about the 3 hours of darkness before Jesus died on the cross. So he would have died right around 3 o'clock. That we have very good evidence about is this 9 to 3 thing. Okay. And then it talks about Joseph of Arimathea going to Pontius Pilate and having him buried before sunset. And at sunset, then they wouldn't have been able to work anymore because now the Sabbath day was now going on. And so that's why they were in a bit of a rush, you could say, to try to get Jesus' body off the cross and into the tomb before the sun had set. Which lays the groundwork then for Easter too, because you have the women going out to the tomb on Easter morning to finish the job with their spices that they were bringing to bury him properly. So, anyway, that's a time right there. Take your questions now. So, I'm going to make a reference to here. This is just how I think happened because based upon the study. So, yeah.
I guess maybe it's my interpretation of crucified, because in John there, I don't feel that when they were going through all this, that he was actually crucified until they got to the mountain and put him on the cross. That's when I consider him being crucified.
Absolutely.
But then, while they're doing all of this, it says later they delivered him to be crucified later.
Yeah.
So how can we say that Mark, at the 3rd hour, is equivalent to what we're talking about here?
It isn't. What we're talking about here is probably around 8 o'clock. And that's what I mean by about the 6th hour that he was on trial, from probably around 2 in the morning to about 8. Because remember, it was during the night. It was an illegal trial that the Jewish council held on Jesus. They weren't supposed to hold anything during the night. Totally illegal. When John says here that it was about the 6 hours, it's not talking about him being crucified. It's about him being before Pontius Pilate, and Pontius Pilate sentencing him to crucifixion.
And that's like at 6 a.m.
I believe it was more like 8, given the fact. The 6 a.m. is when they would have, maybe somewhere in here, between maybe 5 and 7 is when they brought him, Pontius Pilate. And then when Pontius Pilate was going back and forth with Jesus and having him scourged, and it would have been between 6 and 8 o'clock. And then Jesus' sentencing would have happened somewhere between maybe 8 and 9. And then, I don't know, you would have there would have been some time for him to go out to the cross as well. Does that piece it together maybe a little bit better?
Yeah, I think so.
Pastor Fleischer, you had another question? Oh, okay. You know, we didn't look, was Matthew 27:45 the one you were starting to read? That's the one I wanted to have read. Let's look at that, Matthew 27:45. Janelle?
Now from the 6th hour until the 9th hour, there was darkness over all the land.
Okay. Okay, so there it would have had to be at what kind of time? When it says the 6th to the 9th hour,
Jewish time.
Jewish time, yeah. So that would have been from noon till 3 o'clock. Okay, again, that's this right here, this section right here. That is universally understood by most people. Even secular people will recognize that, okay, that would be an accurate time frame there. And then you have Matthew 27, 57 through 60, just a few verses later. Matthew 27, 57 through 60. Could you read that, Clint?
Now when evening had come, there came a rich man from Arimathea named Joseph, who himself had also become a disciple of Jesus. This man went to Pilate and asked for the body of Jesus. Then Pilate commanded the body to be given to him. When Joseph had taken the body, he wrapped it in a clean linen cloth and laid it in his new tomb, which he had hewn out of the rock. And he rolled a large stone against the door of the tomb and departed.
So we're going to read about Joseph of Arimathea later in the book of John too, but there isn't any time references here with Joseph of Arimathea doing this. We can make some really good assumptions about time because we know he died at 3, and very likely the sunset would be around 6. And so during that time, this had to have happened. So we can go on the basis of those things. Because again, the Sabbath day would have started at sunset. Any questions on, any other questions or comments on time? It's an interesting study on the basis of, okay, you got to make sure that the Bible is still the inspired Word of God that has no errors or mistakes. When you begin from that standpoint, then there was a book I have and I couldn't find it that it's called Seeming Contradictions, and I wish I would have been able to find it before this morning. But anyway, that helps out with some of these things. So we have to remember the Bible's inspired; it makes no mistakes. And sometimes you're dealing with, like I said, in the different books of the Bible. Matthew, we know primarily is Jews. Luke is primarily Gentiles. And Mark and John sometimes we aren't really fully sure. Mark tends to go more with the Matthew side of things. And John, he has influence from both sides, it seems. And so, because he himself is Jewish, but yet he's writing at a later time when more Gentiles would have been listening. That's why I think that when he says it's the 6th hour, it's not referencing time, but how much time had transpired. All right, verses 12 through 16. Pastor Fleischer, could you read those? John 19, 12 through 16.
Then Pilate sought to release him. But the Jews cried out, saying, "If you let this man go, you are not Caesar's friend."
Oh, I don't have just a second. I'm sorry, I moved up here. We already did that. Let's do 15 through 16. I'm sorry. Fix that.
But they cried out, away with him, crucify him. Pilate said to them, "Shall I crucify your king?" The chief priests answered, "We have no king but Caesar." Then he delivered him to them to be crucified. So they took Jesus and led him away.
So now that he's here making his judgment, he tries to change their mind, but they keep on insisting, no, crucify him. One last time, And they know that now that he's sitting on the seat, he has to render some sort of judgment. Notice again, Pilate is really making fun of them by calling Jesus their king. That was an insult to them. And it's like, look, here's your best hope. I'm the one in charge here. And you want me to crucify the one that can possibly deliver you? Huh. So he's insulting them to try to get them to try to flex his muscles, so to speak, and release them, be able to release him. Now Peter, he kind of makes the same point to the Jews later in his Pentecostal sermon. Here's your best hope, the one you crucified. And I want to, but it's for little different reasons. Let's just look at that, how Peter references this point later on. In Acts chapter 2, verses 22 through 23, and also verse 36. Acts chapter 2, 22 through 23, and verse 36. Roger, can you read those?
Okay, men of Israel, hear these words of Jesus of Nazareth, a man that testified God to you by miracles, wonders, and signs which God did through him in your midst, as you yourselves also know. Him being delivered by the determined purpose and knowledge of God, you have taken by lawless hands and crucified him and put to death.
And jump down to verse 36.
Therefore, let all the house of Israel know assuredly that God has made this Jesus, whom you crucified, both Lord and Christ.
Okay, so what Peter's getting at here, Pilate, he didn't understand that this was actually the Son of God, even though it had been stated to him many times. But Peter, he used that here you crucified your king. Pilate says, "Do you want me to crucify your king?" Peter said, "You did crucify your king." He was the one who was in full glory as God. He came down here, and you put him to death. He was your best hope, but he's your best hope because you put him to death. And that's the point in verse 36. Let all the house of Israel know assuredly that God has made this Jesus, whom you crucified, both Lord and Christ. And then, of course, we know at Pentecost there were 3,000 souls that were added to the church on that day on the basis of, the sermon and the message that was preached. So they, it was an impactful sermon, you could say. But yet, even though Jesus is their best hope, what do they say in verse 15 here in John 19? They say, "We have no king but Caesar." What a proclamation of allegiance. And yet, what hypocrisy on their part. The Jewish leaders had countless times before Jesus and others showed their hatred and animosity toward the Romans. They didn't like Caesar. They were trying to have independence from him. They didn't want to be under his domain and power and rule. And now they say we have no king but Caesar. How hypocritical of them. It's absolutely crazy to see how they, out in public and for years, they downride the Romans, which would have been meaning a criticism of Caesar, but now they claim that he's their king. That's what happens when hatred takes over in somebody's heart. Is it brings out the worst in people, and people will make claims that before they were, they were all against the Romans. Now they show like they're absolutely in allegiance to them. And the only reason they did that is because they hated Jesus so much that they wanted him dead. And a real sad commentary on their religious leadership. They should have known that. Comments on that? All right, let's look at verses 17 through 22 then. I'm going to go back to you, Janelle.
And he, bearing his cross, went out to a place called the place of the skull, which is called in Hebrew Golgotha. For they crucified him and two others with him, one on either side, and Jesus in the center. Now Pilate wrote a title and put it on the cross, and the writing was, Jesus of Nazareth, the King of the Jews. And many of the Jews read this title.
That's good. I got the verses wrong in some of these. I'm sorry. So he bearing his cross, John is not, he knows that they have Matthew, Mark, and Luke to look exactly how the events transpired while Jesus is going out to the cross. And so he's not saying here that Jesus bore his cross all alone. It just means, and Jesus did bear his cross at the start there, so he's not neglecting that. So those earlier Gospels, or the ones that were written earlier, make it clear that it was Simon of Cyrene that was ending up, he was the one who was forced to take the cross out to Jesus, or for Jesus. And also, it was another thing to think about too, is him carrying that cross, the fact that he had the scourging and all the physical torture he went up to before he went out bearing the cross, because he couldn't take it all the way, demonstrated the fact that he is just an ordinary human being like you and I. He had limits. He was absolutely physically exhausted and couldn't carry it all the way. And then once he got to Golgotha, he's the one crucified in the center between the two robbers. So now Golgotha would have Golgotha, as it says here, means place of a skull. What that referred to, was it a hill that looked like a skull? Probably. I think that's what it meant. But one of the things that you have to keep in mind is over time, erosion takes place, especially in Jerusalem where there was building taking place. Buildings were constructed, then demolished, then reconstructed. The archaeology in Jerusalem is a big mess because there's so many different eras of time that have been there. And so to try to conclusively say, this is where Golgotha is really, who knows? We don't know for sure. Now, we have a good idea of where the temple was because of the archaeology that remains. And one of the things that would have happened is that we are aware that Calvary or Golgotha would have been outside Jerusalem at the time. But just because it was outside Jerusalem at that time doesn't mean it is now, because the city has certainly expanded its boundaries since then. Very likely this was where the Praetorium was, close to the temple, and it's believed that the tomb of Joseph of Arimathea in Golgotha would have been right around the same location. There is a reference in the Bible about the Joseph's tomb being nearby. So it may have been here, but we aren't really for sure. This map has a location not very far at all away from where the Praetorium was. could have been a very short journey. And then this is the same location as what I showed to you earlier. This is, if you go to on a excursion to the Holy Land, they will probably say this is where it was. And I'll show you a picture here right now. They call it the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. They believe that Golgotha where Jesus was buried, the tomb of Jesus would have been in the same place, so they had a whole edifice over it. This is inside that. This is referring to, I guess, the chapel that's built on the location of where they think Golgotha was. If you look just kind of an overview of it, I found this maybe as a way to show that they think that the Calvary was right here and the tomb was not too far away. We don't really know all that. It is interesting, I read a little bit of the history of this, that apparently in the early 100s there was somebody who this would have been 100 years after Jesus died, maybe less, that they right away tried to start building over it where Calvary had been. And this is that location apparently. So there might be some historical significance to it, but who knows? Now, if you talk to someone today, they will say this is Calvary. If you look at the hillside, you see two sunken eyeballs and like where maybe the nose would be, so they apparently say place of the skull. But I have a hard time believing this because, again, erosion. Erosion changes things, and who knows if that's the way it looked back at that time. Here's at a more of a distance, it almost looks that way a little bit more with the two sunken eye features. And, or no, I guess it's over here, isn't it? Yeah. So, anyway, who knows? Has anybody ever been to the Holy Land here? Have you seen this? What did they say about the two places?
I don't really, I think they're saying about the same thing, that could possibly be. They didn't ever say for sure. I mean, it could have been, and it might not have been.
Yeah. Apparently there's archaeologists that are saying there's a third place now, and that it would have been more of a smooth hill, because when they say place of the skull, they were talking just about the upper part of it. But even that, who knows? Who knows? Yes?
Well, a couple of things. First of all, I've also read that one of the reasons for it was that this was the hill where the Romans crucified, and they didn't always do with what they did with Jesus, take him off and bury him. The birds picked the flesh off the crucified. In other words, there were skulls lying around. Now, I don't know if that's accurate, but that's what some suggest, because this was their place of crucifixion. And for that reason, it's called that. But what strikes me again is interesting, and why, getting back to the previous, that John, I think, is here emphasizing for the Gentiles, because in verse 13, he says blood in Hebrew, and then in verse 17, place of the skull, and then in the verse down the line it says, he describes what Sabbath day is, which he wouldn't have to do for the Jews, because he would say, Jesus couldn't have remained on the cross for the Sabbath was a high day. Well, the Jews knew that. The Gentiles didn't. So that's why I think the emphasis here is for the Gentiles. The other thing is that, if you remember that movie, what was the name of it? The Crucifixion of Christ?
There's been several.
Yeah, anyway, that.
Are you talking about Passion of the Christ by Mel Gibson?
Yeah. That they some suggested burying, you know, you see pictures of Christ pulling the cross with the pole dragging behind him. And this movie had just the cross beam as the cross that he was carrying. And I think that probably is more,
It must have been a different one, I don't remember him. Yeah, but what's your point on that?
well, my point is when carrying the cross, we don't say he didn't carry that whole thing, the pole and the cross beam. He carried the cross beam, which was part of the cross, but again, the point was he was carrying the burden of the crucifixion or the cross, but I have a hard time believing that he was carrying the whole pole and the cross beam.
Oh, I see.
And some, that's why I've seen pictures of he's carrying it, you know, like this on his shoulders. I don't know, it makes a difference that he was crucified, that's all we know, and that's important. But,
So you're talking about more like one of your previous pictures when he was standing in front, he had that beam across his shoulder. One of your photos.
Yeah.
He was standing in front of,
Yeah, you're saying that,
so that's what he's referring to.
right? Yeah. I don't remember the picture. Sometimes the pictures I'm making the point, I don't know if I'm not trying to illustrate anything else beyond that, but yeah, I suppose. Heidi?
I think it's a shame that if they really thought the place where that church is was Golgotha, that they covered it up, like, with a building. Like, if I'm gonna go to the Holy Land and, like, try to envision what it may have been like, which, like you said, it has changed a lot physically and architecturally, but, like, I'm gonna have a hard time envisioning what it was like if
Yeah.
I'm in a building, because it
Yeah.
wasn't in a building.
So,
For me.
part of the history, and I would have dug into it just so you're aware, is part of the history maybe that someone did it to try to get at